With, and I add my condolences to the families of people who were affected by the tragic events at the weekend. Now, First Minister, you will be well aware of the environmental effects of wood burning. Wood burning is seen by some environmentalists as a source of air pollution. Burning wood from trees also releases concentrated toxins back into the air, increasing our carbon footprint. So I would like to ask you, First Minister, what is the Welsh Government's policy regarding the burning of wood?
Well, we are supportive of biomass, but of course we want to make sure that the energy mix is as broad as possible, whilst taking into account our commitments in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. And that's why, of course, we've seen biomass plants around Wales. Of course, biomass is renewable in the sense that you can replant trees in a way, for example, that isn't possible with coal.
Thank you for that answer. There are some contentious arguments going on about wood burning and biomass as to whether that really is renewable, so I will task you on that, if I may. Now, a few weeks ago at First Minister's Questions, you were telling us how EU regulations and guidance were helping Wales and the UK to protect the environment. And yet, I now see that the EU has recently promoted the burning of wood as an environmentally friendly and renewable fuel, as you just referred to the practice yourself. However, in adopting this position, the EU has drawn quite pointed criticism from many respected environmental scientists. For example, Eric Lambin of Stanford University said, "Treating wood as a carbon-neutral fuel is a simple policy decision with complex cascading effects on forest use, energy systems, wood trade and biodiversity worldwide." End of quote. The worry is that by treating wood burning as a virtuous renewable fuel, we can end up desecrating forests, increasing the harvesting of global woodland, and ultimately producing increased emissions of greenhouse gas. Bearing all that in mind, First Minister, is your government still confident that the EU is delivering the environmental protections that you have been telling us about?
Yes, because, well, let me see if I can explain it. Wood comes from trees, and trees grow. And trees, you can plant trees, they will grow, and they are replaceable in the way that coal, for example, as a fossil fuel, isn't. And I come back to the point I made earlier on, a few weeks ago in this chamber. It's because of the EU that the UK cleaned up its act. The UK was one of the worst polluters in Europe. There was a river, I believe it was the River Irwell in Salford, that would catch light if a lit match was thrown into it. Air quality was bad. We contributed hugely to acid rain. Our beaches were filthy. All those things have changed because European regulations have cleaned up Britain. And the last thing I'd want to see is us going back to those dark days in the 80s where, for example, the River Ogmore in Bridgend used to run different colours according to what had been put into it upriver. I saw it run green, red, black. I mean, take your pick, really. The level of pollution was horrendous. Those days can never return.
Yes. You're using your well-worn anecdote about the River Irwell in Salford again. Well, we don't have to go as far away as the River Irwell. You also quote the River Ogmore. We had two rivers in Cardiff that would also change colours, so I'm not disagreeing with you on that. The Taff would turn black with coal dust. The Ely would change into various bright colours as it passed Ely Paper Mill, depending on which colour dye had just been flushed into the river. But going back to the River Irwell, I'd quote from a recent Cardiff University paper which referenced the recent edition of the journal Natural Geoscience. I quote, "But a recent analysis of the Irwell system in the northwest of England found the highest concentration of plastic recorded in any river in the world." End quote. So even with all of these wonderful EU regulations, the river is still apparently suffering from some fairly major pollution. Now, I think there are a couple of points to be made here. One is that you talk about my party, UKIP, wanting the UK to leave the EU as though we don't want any environmental regulations. And you speak as if the moment the UK does leave the EU, all of the environmental regulations will disappear overnight. Clearly this is nonsense and you're merely scaremongering. There is a continuity bill which will ensure that all of the environmental regulations, every single one of them, will be preserved in UK law until such time as the UK Parliament has had time to assess that regulation and determine whether or not to keep it, to amend it or to dispose of it. That process will take some time, obviously, because the legislators will have thousands of EU regulations to examine. But another point I would like to make is
you do need to get to a question.
You seem to have a blind faith in EU directives and regulations. And yet,
And now I can't hear whether he is getting to a question.
I am,
yes,
Louise.
thank you, Gareth.
And yet the EU supports wood burning, and we have people in Wales facing potential health risks as a result of that wood burning. There were at least 3 fires in South Wales at wood recycling plant last year alone. Your Natural Resources Wales, which you oversee, gave a licence to a biomass incinerator neighbouring residential properties near Barry Dock. There's acrid black smoke.
I do need a question now.
How do you respond to the acrid black smoke being suffered by residents near that wood-burning incinerator?
Well, I mean, his party, as far as I'm aware, is in favour of more coal, which means more open cast, actually, because that's the only way to really get at coal in Wales now. It's very, very difficult to sink any deep mines, even if we wanted to access that coal, and hugely expensive because of the geological faults, particularly in South Wales. But I'm not sure whether he's saying that somehow the EU is polluting Britain with biomass, and he quotes the River Irwell. So there's work to be done there, clearly, with plastic. But the point is this. I don't make the point that somehow all environmental regulations will fall away as soon as we leave the EU. I make the point that it was the EU that forced Britain to clean up its act. The UK had an awful record when it came to pollution. It was forced to clean up beaches, clean up rivers, clean up the sea because of European regulation. I would not want to see a situation in the future where we went backwards because of some crazed free market ideology that said that environmental regulation is something that should be light touch. Absolutely not. We pride ourselves on our environment in Wales. We pride ourselves on the fact that it's been cleaned up so much over the past 30 years, and it will not go backwards.
Question 3.
Question 3.